afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. I love Costa Rica. It's a beautiful country, so thank you for having me back. I don't go anywhere without my smartphone, and there's two good reasons. Twitter saved my life twice. The first time that Twitter saved my life was in November of 2011, after a 5-day battle between us, the revolution in Egypt, and the security forces. A friend and I went to the front lines of the clashes, and we were entrapped by security forces. Everybody managed to escape because we realized that we were entrapped by undercover security forces and thugs working with the regime. And I thought my friend had managed to escape, but they had taken him across the street from the abandoned store where I was held, and they held his arms behind his back and beat him as he could see them beating me. And I was surrounded by 4 or 5 riot police, I can't remember exactly how many now, and they beat me with their nightsticks. And so to protect my head, I put my arms up like this, and they broke my left arm and my right hand in 2 places. And then they sexually assaulted me, and I was detained for 12 hours. 6 hours by the Interior Ministry and 6 hours by military intelligence. The head of military intelligence at the time was a man called Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who is now our fascist dictator in Egypt. During the 6 hours that I was held in the Interior Ministry, I realized I didn't have my phone. And as I said, I don't go anywhere without my phone, and I lost it. It fell to the ground when I was being beaten. And as the riot police were dragging me to the Interior Ministry, I actually said to them, "Stop, stop, I need to get my phone." As if they were going to say, "Okay, boys, stop beating Mona, let her get her phone, and then we continue beating her again." Of course they didn't. But 3 hours into my detention in the Interior Ministry, I saw 2 activists come in for an unrelated matter. They were coming to negotiate a truce between us and the security forces. And I managed to sit next to one of the activists, and I asked him to get me on Twitter. And he got me on, and I sent out a tweet that said, "Beaten, arrested, Interior Ministry." And literally, 10 seconds later, his phone battery died. If his phone battery was already dead when he came in, I don't know what would have happened to me. I was told after I was released that within 15 minutes, #FreeMona was trending globally. Al Jazeera and The Guardian were reporting on my detention, and the State Department tweeted back at me saying, "We hear you and we're working on this." I'm incredibly lucky. Yes, my arm and my hand were broken. Yes, I was sexually assaulted. Yes, I was interrogated in a blindfold despite these fractures. But I'm incredibly lucky because I had access to that smartphone and because people heard me. If I was an ordinary Egyptian woman that nobody knew, if I didn't have this name in the media, I might have been gang raped, as the security forces supervising officer threatened me with, and I might have been killed. The second time that Twitter saved my life was a year later in New York City. You heard I'm Egyptian American. And I like to think that the revolution moves with us according to our context, and that we challenge that context in the ways that hurt and the ways that provoke, and we find the places in our various contexts that hurt and we push. And the second time that Twitter saved my life was after I was arrested after I spray painted over a racist and bigoted ad in the New York subway. I'm Egyptian American and I'm also a Muslim. And I moved to the United States a year before the 9/11 attacks. And I've witnessed how American Muslims have been bullied relentlessly in the United States to apologize for something that we had nothing to do with. And so when this ad campaign went up in the New York subway in 2012, I saw the words, and the words basically said, "In the war between the civilized man and the savage, always choose the civilized man, support Israel, defeat jihad." I read this and I said, "Fuck no." I went out to the subway with a can of spray paint, and it was pink. And I chose pink because my nieces love pink. I'm a feminist, and I believe pink is as feminist as you want it to be. And I chose pink because it's also the least violent color that you can think of. And I wanted to spray over this racist and bigoted ad the words racist, but I don't know if any of you have picked up a spray can. They're very difficult to use. I'm not a tagger, and I need tagging lessons. So by the time I arrived and I started to spray, I realized I was just going to get blobs out on the ad. But never mind, I got the blobs out on the ad. I did not want to cover what the ad said, because I don't believe in censorship, but I believe in protest, and I believe in nonviolent civil disobedience, because that's what the United States for decades has used as part of the revolution, whether it was for civil rights, whether it was for feminism, or against the Vietnam War, and now in the various hashtag Black Lives Matter movements that you see across the United States. Now, I mentioned those 2 times that Twitter, this is how Twitter saved me. So I was arrested and I was jailed overnight, and I gave a friend of mine my password and username for Twitter, and she was tweeting all night for me. And in the morning when I was arraigned before a judge, I had no idea what was going to happen. I'd never spent the night in jail in the US before. And this man came up to me in the courtroom with long gray hair, and we went into the small room where the attorney and the client meet, and he said to me, listen, I have no idea who you are, but last night on Twitter, 200 people from the Occupy movement wrote to me and said, go and represent Mona. And this man, Stanley Cohen, became my attorney for free, pro bono, and just before the Christmas vacation, a judge in New York dropped my case because I was charged with criminal mischief and making graffiti and possession of a graffiti instrument. And the judge dropped my case in the interest of justice. So I consider this a great victory. Now, I mention these both times that Twitter saved my life and the Egyptian and American side of me because, as I said, the revolution moves. And the revolution provokes, and the revolution hurts. And what you've seen start in the various countries in the Middle East and North Africa has been a political revolution that began with the realization by men and women that our various dictators oppress us all. These are dictators that are usually backed by the United States, that buy billions of dollars worth of weapons from their various Western allies. And those various Western allies, a long time ago, sold us out because they decided that they support stability, which is a dictator in place for a very long time, against the interest of us, the people of those countries, because if they had chosen our side, stability comes through freedom and dignified lives. And this is what the revolution is about in the Middle East and North Africa. So the revolutions began as political revolutions that wanted to hurt and provoke those various regimes. And we managed to get rid of some of those dictators, like Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, who ruined our lives for 30 years. 5 US presidents supported Hosni Mubarak when he was in office. But here's the thing, when the revolution stops at being just political, you end up replacing one Mubarak with another. So in Egypt, we've seen one Mubarak replace another. They're just called different things. For the first year, we had a military junta of 19 Mubaraks. And then we had elections, and we had a man from the Muslim Brotherhood called Mohammed Morsi, who turned into a Mubarak. And then he was overthrown by that man I told you who was head of the military intelligence called Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who was promoted to the head of the military and defense ministry by Morsi. So we have another Mubarak now. And just last week, we commemorated the 4th anniversary of our revolution. Now, I hate the term Arab Spring. The revolution is not a season, and it's not a color, it's not a flower, it's not a cake. The revolution and the uprising is thousands upon thousands of courageous people who risk their lives by going out to tell the political regime, we are here to hurt you and make you uncomfortable. But when the women, and my concern now is women, because I'm a feminist, first and foremost. When the women looked around at the men that we went out in the revolution with, the question became, whose side are you on? And the realization moved to the forefront that if our regimes oppressed everybody, our societies, comprised of the regime, the street, and the home, oppress women. So unless the political revolution becomes a social and a sexual revolution, it will fail. How does it become a social and sexual revolution? That's my life's goal. That's my obsession. And I will give you some examples. But before I move into the feminist and the social and the sexual in the Middle East and North Africa, I want to take you back to the United States for a while, because when I talk about women's issues, unfortunately, the stereotypes of Arab and Muslim men, especially when I speak outside of the Middle East, the stereotype becomes, oh, those barbaric men who treat their women terribly. Oh, those Muslim men, oh, those Arab men. That is not what I'm here to do. I'm not here to sell out the men of my culture to make you feel good, because misogyny and patriarchy exist all over the world. And I mentioned that I'm Egyptian American. And over the past 13 years that I've been connected to the United States, not only have I seen the relentless bullying of Muslims in the United States, primarily driven by a religious right wing, but I've seen that religious right wing try to destroy the reproductive rights that were fought for by decades by thousands upon thousands of courageous women in the United States. There are areas in the United States now where it's almost impossible to get an abortion unless you're a rich white woman, and that is wrong. Those people of the religious right wing, mostly men, are very much like the religious right wing where I come from in Egypt. We have in Egypt the Muslim Brotherhood, and in the United States I call them the Christian Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood and the Christian Brotherhood are obsessed with my vagina. And my message to them is, stay out of my vagina unless I want you in there. Taking that message now back to the Middle East and North Africa and reminding everybody that the religious right wing globally are obsessed with us as women, especially our vaginas. I'm going to give you some examples of how the social and the sexual revolution has begun in the Middle East and North Africa, and why, when the various anniversaries of the revolutions are commemorated where I come from, when I hear people from outside of the region say the Arab Spring has turned into the Arab winter, this is why I hate the term Arab Spring. It is not a season, it's a revolution. And revolutions are not finished in 4 years. Revolutions are not cakes that you bake, and then once they're out of the oven, you eat them and you're happy and it's finished. Revolutions go through cycles. Revolutions hurt. Revolutions leave marks on your bodies. Revolutions have your friends in jail. Revolutions have your friends surviving a football massacre in a stadium that we just commemorated. February the 1st, 2012, 74 football fans were massacred in a stadium in Port Said in Egypt because the fans of that football team dared to chant against the military regime. Revolutions hurt. Revolutions do not finish in 4 years. And the women in the Middle East or North Africa understand that our bodies are the battlegrounds upon which this revolution is being fought. And in March of last year, I traveled across several countries in the region with a producer from the BBC to make a radio documentary for the BBC World Service to see how the revolution, the social and the sexual revolution, is challenging various authorities in our part of the world. Because if anything, the revolution is a big no to authority. And the authorities that I mentioned, remember, were the regime, the street, and the home. We've overthrown Mubarak in the presidential palace. We must overthrow Mubarak in the bedroom, in the living room, and on the street, and primarily the Mubarak in our mind. So when I went to Tunisia, I met with women who fought to get in their constitution the first language of its kind in the Arab world that guarantees equality between men and women. And one of the women who fought for this started a social movement. It's basically a lobby and pressure group called Al-Bosla, which in Arabic means compass. And what that group does is it goes and watches and listens to politicians as they try to work out the future of their country. So while the Tunisian Constitutional Assembly was working on the constitution, she went to watch and she threatened with her social movement to take the pictures and the names of the men who opposed this language on equality and to put them on the streets of the capital of Tunis, to name and shame, essentially. And the first time she went to the sessions, she wanted to ask a question of one of these men of the religious right wing. He belonged to what's known as the Salafi movement, which is the ultra-orthodox, ultra-conservative movement in Tunisia. And he wouldn't take her question. And she said to him, I'm trying to ask you a question. And he said to her, I don't talk to women who are naked. It's because she wasn't veiled. She said to him, naked, huh? So she started to unbutton her blouse and to take off her pants. And he said, "What are you doing? Stop, stop." She said to him, "You want to see naked? I'll show you naked." And she threatened to strip in the Constitutional Assembly. That's a woman going up to an authority figure who for the longest time had never been challenged before because he used his religion as a shield. And she told him, no. And he had to listen to her. And he had to respect her. And after the Constitution passed, with that article guaranteeing equality, she actually went up to him and hugged him, and he hugged her back. In Saudi Arabia, one of the most conservative countries in the region, where a revolution hasn't begun on the streets, it has begun socially. I often like to quote the Chicano labor organizer Cesar Chavez, who said that social change is like teaching someone to read and write. You can never unteach them to read and write. And what has been happening in the Middle East and North Africa, as people across the region are watching what we're doing, is they're learning a form of reading and writing that they can never unlearn. So you might not see them on the streets today, standing up to the tanks and the armored personnel carriers, but the revolution has begun in here. And in Saudi Arabia, for the women, these phones and the cameras are an important part of it, because Saudi Arabia is the only country on earth that doesn't allow women to drive. And every year, Saudi women go to jail, some, and others risk jail by getting into their cars on October the 26th and filming themselves driving and posting those films on YouTube as a direct act of civil disobedience. I mentioned civil disobedience in my Spraying the Ad. This is their civil disobedience, a non-violent form of civil disobedience that is telling their religious and their political leaders, no, we will be free. And in Egypt, part of that social and sexual revolution is to take this very sensitive and taboo subject of sexual violence and to explode it and to talk about it openly. In 2005, the Mubarak regime began to use systematic sexual assault against women journalists and activists. And for the first time in Egypt's modern history, women activists went on TV and talked about it openly, and it was a huge shock. Now, since the revolution began, we've been hearing about mob sexual assaults that are unprecedented. Sexual harassment in Egypt now, street sexual harassment is at epidemic levels. And people keep asking, why are these mob sexual assaults targeting women so horrifically? First of all, more women are willing to talk about them and to break that taboo, because we recognize, and I talk about my own sexual assault as much as I can, because we recognize that the shame does not lie in us. We have done nothing to be ashamed of. The shame lies in the men who violated us. And second of all, in speaking about this, it's enabling and empowering other women to talk about it. When you get on TV and you talk about this, other women at first are shocked, and then they begin to make all these connections. If the regime can violate my body, we had so-called virginity tests, which are basically sexual assaults of female revolutionaries that the military subjected women to in 2011. If the regime can do this, then of course the street will do this, and the two are connected, and then you begin to connect that to the violence at home. So we have groups of women now who go out and organize bodyguards. One group is called Tahrir Bodyguard. Whenever there were protests, now protests in Egypt are very difficult because of our current fascist dictator. But when we had protests before our draconian protest law was put into effect, women and male allies would go out and protect other women in the protests in ways we'd never seen before in Egypt. More women are willing to drag men to police stations and file sexual assault cases against them. But my own personal revolution, my own way of taking the personal and making it the social and sexual revolution is to say, we can't stop at sexual violence. We have to move and push through the violence and start talking about sex as a positive thing. I come from a culture and a religious background that treats sex as a taboo. And so for me, I want to break down that taboo. I want to say, yes, sexual violence and sexual assaults are awful and terrible, but we have to push through that and start talking about pleasure and desire. Because when a woman from the culture and religion I come from talks about sex and says, yes, I enjoy sex, it is my right to have pleasure, that in and itself is the revolution. And I'm going to wrap up now with basically what happened after I survived my own assault and why I look the way I do, because there is a reason for it. Both of my arms were in a cast for 3 months after the riot police assaulted me. And I'm a writer, and not to be able to use my fingers to type was very difficult. Words were always my weapons. And so having my arms in casts for 3 months forced me to think of how I can get my message across. And I thought my body is a great way to get my message across. So I promised myself when my bones healed, I would dye my hair red because it's a fierce color and you can't miss it. And I would get 2 tattoos. One of the ancient Egyptian goddess Sekhmet. She's the goddess of retribution and sex. And I say yes, please to both. And the other is the name of the street where I was attacked, because it's an icon of our revolution now. 40 people were killed on this street, all of them heroes and martyrs of the revolution, and the Arabic word for freedom, because we were liberated in this street. So again, the revolution is inside, the revolution is on our bodies, the revolution travels with us, and ultimately, the revolution is no to the religious right wing everywhere, and to say, my vagina is mine, stay out of it unless I want you in there. Thank you.